Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this hopefully interesting and entertaining roundtable or discussion round here. I'm going to do the following. I'm going to introduce each of the participants here one by one, ask them a single question that they hopefully answer very shortly so that we can have enough time for discussion. And then we will see where we're getting at. Unfortunately, we don't have much time, so I will not invite you to ask questions. However, we will be there in the speaker area afterwards in case you have questions, in case you want to have a further discussion. I will be there. I'm sure the participants here will also be there. So please come there and visit us afterwards. The first panelist I would like to introduce is Professor Katharina Zweig. She's head of the Algorithm Accountability Lab in Kaiserslautern. She studied bioinformatics, obtained a PhD there, is co-founder of Algorithm Watch, and she is a member of the Enquete Commission on AI of the German Bundestag. And the question that I would like to ask you first is, what do you think are the ethical aspects overall when you use AI?
Yeah, so in Germany we're always very critical. So I think the most important thing is that we have a differentiated approach. So is AI as itself really dangerous? No, I don't think so. It depends on whether we are dealing with products and things or humans. And of course we should have a deeper look when we deal with humans than if we deal with objects.
Thanks. So the second panelist that I would like to introduce is Professor Christoph Leudtke. He has a background or a PhD in business informatics, so also technical background, very nice, and a background in philosophy. I think most of you know him as the professor that got awarded or donated 6.5 million over 5 years for creating a chair on ethics in artificial intelligence at the TU Munich. And for me, the first question would be, how would you define business ethics?
Yeah, there's a famous joke, a very old joke actually, that students comes to the professor and said, where can I study business ethics? And the professor says, well, you have to decide on either one. However, as I said, this is a very old joke, and I think this is not what business ethics is about. Instead, I think it's important to recognize that ethics needs to be an integral part of your core business for any company. And the same holds, as I believe, for the ethics of AI. You have to integrate ethical values and principles right into the AI approach that you are using, and that will be also important for your long-term success.
Okay, thanks. The third panelist here, last but not least, Ms. Tanja Böhm, Director of Corporate Affairs and Ambassador for Ethical AI at Microsoft, and a lawyer of trade, which is also handy in this discussion, I believe. And the question to you is, how can companies ensure overall to have ethically correct usage of artificial intelligence?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, let me first say I think we're all excited about the potential that AI actually brings to society and to economy. But we also see all the challenges that come along with AI actually, because as you said, as soon as humans are affected, we have to take a deeper look into it. And as you said, by developing AI solutions, one has to take ethical values into consideration. This is why we as Microsoft, for example, installed already 2 years ago an Ether board. ESO stands for AI and Ethics in Research and Engineering. It's a senior leadership team of Microsoft Corporation, but also external researchers and further experts who come together and decide case by case on ethical implementation into certain kind of deals, for example. So having said that, let me state that for me, Microsoft, it's key that when you develop AI solutions, you have to look into ethics as well and incorporate and make decisions if the solution is ethical or not. And yeah.
So when we let me start opening up the question, and then please feel free to join and discuss. I think we heard that Microsoft and many other companies, of course the company I'm representing, SAP as well, like many, they define and they own principles. The question that I think is interesting is, how do you come to these kind of principles, and how do you define values for a corporation? And maybe I hand it over first to you, Katharina, and then let's take it on the discussion.
Yeah, the thing is that we don't only see companies doing that. Actually, at the moment, it's overwhelming, the many papers we see on ethics in AI. And I think it turns out, basically, it's the morality of doing good decisions. So it's not entirely new. The new thing is that if we incorporate it into a machine, it will kind of get its own life. And this is the main problem. So how do we get at these values? Not very differently than we always did. We look into history, we look into philosophy, we look into what went wrong historically, and then we come up with always the same values, and it's mainly about human rights.
I agree with what you are saying. We also have to look into the future, I think. So there are some principles of ethics that will be new and that will be particular to AI, as I believe. So I was part of one of the European groups that came up with European guidelines recently. And one of the principles that they choose, which was new, which was the principle of explainability. And I think this is a key principle that is a new one for ethics in total, and that is particular to AI. And how will we be able to implement that actually? What does it mean for a system, for an algorithm to be explainable? What do we have to do as developers? I think this is very important, and this is something where we would also like to work on in the new institute.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I fully agree. Basically, nothing more to add. Yeah, but probably no. Let me build on what you said about values. I mean, of course, we do have common values here in Germany, or maybe also in Europe, but when it comes to developing AI, for me the key question is, do we take like the Western world values, or if you look to the Eastern world, like talk about China, you know, AI development in China, where, for example, the privacy rules or approach is much different. So for me the key question is, whose values actually do we take? Yeah.
But I would actually like to say something. So I think that explainability is not entirely new. Of course, if you go to a judge, you want the judgment to be transparent. You have due diligence. So we have all kinds of processes that are transparent. So I don't think that's really a new ethical principle. Whenever it's something of worth, then you need to be explained to why you get this decision. On the other hand, I wouldn't say that we require explainability of AI for every AI, right? If I get the wrong recommendation for a new suit, I don't need explainability.
Yes, I agree with that. I think we shouldn't overdo it. Whereas what I would like to stress is there's a difference between transparency and explainability. So because we ask, or many people ask for transparency of algorithms, whereas in many cases that actually wouldn't be of very much use if you just make your code transparent. You don't know what the algorithm does or what the code does. So it is sometimes it's better to see to take it as a black box and see what it does, what results it gets to actually. And but I also agree that in some cases that might be too much.
So when we think about, let's say we have defined this principle for corporations, I think we have heard from you there are ways how to implement that. I think there are best practices that are shaping up, like you define principles, you define a board, you have processes in place. The interesting question that I ask myself when I see this is, isn't it the case that corporates are in that way somehow pushed into a position where they're also enforcing and judging on what is ethical use? So I understand that creation of values and defining of values is something good, and that for you as a corporation you want to define for your people that belong to that corporation what they're doing. But I think there is there's a thin line and a boundary to starting to prescribe, as you said, to other environments, to your clients, to your customers, some kind of ethical guidelines as well, and by that also making yourself a judge and a prosecutor in that as well. So,
Sure.
What I would like to hear your feedback on is, do you see that as an issue, and do you see, let's say, ways out of that dilemma? Because I'm sure that all corporates, they want to implement that, and they want to live to their ethical guidelines that they're giving.
Sure. I mean, let me first state again, for me it's key that each company has an own discussion and set of principles or ethical framework. But it's kind of self-regulation from each company. And so I think there are various scenarios where we actually need to call for regulation. We need to ask the regulators to frame the AI. For example, Brad Smith, when he was here in February, Microsoft Berlin, he called for regulation of facial recognition technology, because we've also seen some approaches from governments, asking us to use or to implement our facial recognition technology into some settings which we do not support. So this is why we're calling for regulation there. And, yeah.
So it is my experience that actually companies are looking for guidance in developing such frameworks. So having sat on a number of ethics committees like that with members of corporations, it's my experience that they are looking for something that they can use. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg also just recently said that he regards the General Data Protection Regulation as a kind of model for the entire world, which was, I think, to some extent very surprising. Yeah. And so I think we need also there to find new ways of installing dialogues, but also cooperating between academia and corporations, civil society and politics as well on these matters.
So actually my starting point was that we as data scientists are doing ethical decisions. And so we decided how can a data scientist, how can a computer scientist make any ethical decision, because this is really not what we have an education for. So our way was to create a new field of study called socioinformatics, which you can only study in Kaiserslautern, so please all come to us. And but of course, so they have a training as a software engineer, and then they get all the ethics and business and law information that they need to be able to identify ethical questions, not to solve them. And I think this is the dilemma. None of us can do this alone, so we need interdisciplinary teams, we need broad teams, but it needs to be in a differentiated approach. We can't do it for every AI, that would just be too much. So we need a nice framework for selecting those where we need to do it and those where we don't need to do it.
Yeah. I just would like to add that in our new Institute for Ethics in AI, we will also be forming teams, in particular tandems of one person or maybe several from the technical disciplines, from informatics and engineering, working together with someone from ethics or law or governance in order to just look over over each other's shoulder and see what suggestions you might have, what would you do with this and that algorithm, for example, that program, and so on. I think that's important.
So I think it's an interesting point to also stress that, of course, you have, let's say, business people in corporates, you have technical people in the IT business. You don't have many philosophers running around, usually, maybe except for people who claim to have a PhD, as a side note. But I think that one of the interesting parts, and that is also a personal interest for me, is, do you have any recommendation of how to understand what are the well-known frameworks that can be applied? So what I heard from you is that, of course, let's say, there's the philosophical discussions that are going on, and what we need to do is basically take these frameworks that have been developed over the centuries, I would say, and somehow apply them to new technologies, apply them to situations that we have not been in there, if at all. I mean, it's debatable how much of new situations are created, but the question is there any framework, is there any way to break it down, to say, okay, Kant said this, or XYZ said that. Now I'm breaking it down, I'm working on it, or is there a bottom-up approach? What is your recommendation on that?
Never let a machine decide what you wouldn't want to decide yourself. Yeah, something like this, maybe. Yeah. No, I don't think there is one principle. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. What we try to develop at the moment together with the Porsche Digital Lab here in Berlin is a software development process in which we start with, is this project going to have any ethical implications or not? And if so, in what kind of category does it fall? Does it have a very high impact or a smaller one? And then we try to deduce controlling mechanisms that alleviate the risk and that make transparent how we come to a conclusion, how we make a design decision. And I think this is all you can ask for. So it needs to be an agile development process that always controls, for example, discrimination, and then you should be on a good side.
Yeah, I believe it's not possible to just take philosophy, this is the theory, and then you apply it to different areas. This doesn't work in other areas of ethics as well, so like business ethics in general, it's not that simple. However, you can take certain principles and you can still make use of, say, the categorical imperative or Rawls' theory of fairness, and then see what you can do with it. If you work on the phenomenon, as philosopher would say, so on the theory, but also on the systems or programs together, and then you might arrive at some original principles. I was, for example, a member of this ethics committee for autonomous cars, and we did precisely that. So we had some general principles that came from philosophy, but also from other areas, and I think we managed to apply some of them in a meaningful way.
So how did you do that? Did you have philosophers coming over to Microsoft discussing that?
They're still part of the Ether board, which I mentioned earlier. Yeah. So philosophers, engineers, also outside from Microsoft, different researchers. So basically, all kind of science you can imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then you're breaking it down. Let's say bottom up or top down. I mean, from my experience, I'm also on the ethical board of SAP. Mm-hmm. What we see is you have two ways of doing that. Basically, you can say I'm taking guiding principles. You define that, and I think we have the EU high-level group now also putting up, for example, a framework that could be used, mm-hmm. And then you try to go from there and see what does it mean in practice, or you say, I'm trying to take, so this I want, this I don't want, this I want, this I don't want, and then you hope that over time patterns are appearing that you can elevate them. So what approach did you take on this?
So after intensively discussing with outside of Microsoft, internal Microsoft, in this Ether board we defined 6 principles. And each single case that has a connection to AI, customer deal, this case goes to the Ether board, and the Ether board takes the 6 principles and applies them to this special deal, and then the board takes a decision. Mm-hmm. And this is why we also installed AI and ethics champs, like in various countries, and their function is to connect with the business in their in their local region, and to report actually any specific AI cases to the Ether board. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think your example was very interesting because one of the principles that you had in the report was something like never count up. So if there was an accident with a car, never count the number of people who could die here or there. And when we look at how people would decide, they do count. And so this already makes it very, very apparent that it's hard to find principles by which we could always go by. Yeah, so there will always be a conflict between whatever values we choose.
Well, we said there shouldn't be a simple calculation. We actually said that it might be okay to have the overall number of injuries minimized, and this is I think a very important principle. Because it means that at least under certain conditions it is allowed to calculate, but not just to take the numbers, and that is too simple. I think there is, if I may add that too, there is sometimes a confusion about the term ethics, because in particular in the Anglo-Saxon world it's used in a different way. For example, you have a chief ethics officer who's just dealing with legal issues, whereas we in Germany we take ethics to be much broader, and I think this is important to distinguish. So when we are talking about ethics, this should be about benefit to other people, to the environment, to in terms of human rights, for example, in terms of minorities, against discrimination. I think this is important to see. And so there is something ethical about AI. I think this is important to say. So not just ethics. AI is in principle, it is evil, yeah, but if we have some rules, it might be good. No, I mean, it can do a lot of good. We will need some rules, yes, in order to also establish trust in the technology, so that people will accept it eventually. But I think it's important to see that there is a lot of good that ethics can do in terms of all sorts of benefits, let's say in terms of anti-discrimination, in terms of making more use of information to be in favor in terms of sustainability, and of course, not last but not least, protecting people against injuries or removing fatalities.
But let me be a bit devil's advocate here. I mean, of course, it's clear that AI can do good and bad, and you can take a knife and spread butter. You can take a knife and stab someone. This is, but I think that AI actually is subsuming a lot of technologies with which you can produce the applications that then can do something. So in a way, it's not a knife, it's something to sharpen a metal. And then the metal, with this sharpened metal, you can do stuff. So a technology itself, at least from my perspective, is hard to even attribute whether it's good or evil. It's always what people apply it to and what kind of tools they build with this technology, which is the difference between having a technology and having a product, right? Or do you have a different opinion on that?
Anyone want to? So I mean, I agree, and that's why we need the ethical rules for that. And I believe also that it's not just detailed regulation that we need, because you can't just start with regulating details, for example, about autonomous driving, if you don't address the basic issues, the fundamental issues, and talk about them in the societal context. I think this is much more important. We will also arrive at regulation at some point, but I mean, there's a lot of things that we don't know about the technologies. If we just draw the famous red lines and say this is not what we want, I think it's too early to do that right now. We should look what can the technology do, and in what way can it improve from the prior situation we had. This is, by the way, different from the knife example, because you have a knife, but you didn't have anything before. Of course, you can use the knife in this and that way. But AI is meant to be an improvement in many ways about this, for example, about the traffic situation, about non-autonomous cars that we have now. So I think it might do a lot of good, but we need the ethical rules. I agree.
I think it must be key for developers to think, well, analog to the doctor's Hippocratic oath, also Hippokratischer Eid, yeah. Do no harm. So maybe we should actually call for code like that for coders as well, for developers, yeah. That when they start developing a code, it must be key for them to do no harm whatever they develop. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. It's really difficult. So we have looked at one AI software which is used in the US in court, and it has been used, or it has been trained for people getting out of prison. And then the question was, who gets rehabilitation, who gets drug therapy? And for this, the machine would devise a risk score on how likely it is that this person will recidivate, so make another crime. the thing is, it was based on questions like, was your father already in prison? Was your mother already in prison? And this is an excellent predictor or that whether somebody will recidivate or not. And I think it's okay to use it if you do it after prison and try to find out who's really in need. Once you have the technology, it's very easy that it slips into a different social context where it's not okay anymore. And specifically with that system, if it puts you in a high-risk category of violent crime, then it's only 20% correct. And so this is really a machine that maybe shouldn't have been built, maybe not even for the post-trial thing, because it's clear that once you have the technology, it just slips into different situations. Or we need to make sure that the machine knows, I can only be used post-trial, I should not be used pre-trial, something like this.
But this is an excellent question. I mean, when I look at AI as a technology, it's basically about automating what humans were doing beforehand. So what you were saying, and what you were saying as well, is that we have to ask people to ask these questions and to be aware of the values that they stand for when they're developing these systems. But yeah. Honestly speaking, isn't that what we as humans should all be doing? Isn't that what corporates should be doing with the way they're doing business, with the way they're creating products, not only in IT industry?
I mean, ethics, I think this is a kind of misunderstanding. This is often around, that ethics is just your personal ethics that you learned, that you were brought up with, and that is it. And you just have to apply it when you're in a company, for example. I think this is much too simple because the incentives and the possible sanctions, all the situational conditions that you are within in a company are much more complicated than that. And often you just cannot straightforwardly apply the ethics that you have learned. And then there is the question, what will carry the day, ethics or business? And I think it's important not to put the people into that situation, but as a company, structure the situation in a different way, like put organizational programs like compliance programs or in terms of integrity and many things in practice, which then will also make the situation different for your employees and not to put them in this dilemma.
So I just had a long call with a colleague who designed the Ams algorithm. You might have heard of it. It's used in Austria in a better version to find out whether an unemployed person should get some money and some help, some further education or not. And he told me he would only accept proposals to build a new system if it's guaranteed that the machine will only be a second opinion, first, and second, that the result of the machine's risk score will be discussed in a dialogue. And so I think this is an excellent rule that says, I only want to build a system that comes into a specific social context. And with that, I think it's an okay system. And he also told me that compared to human decision makers, his machine can be much more nuanced than the human decision maker. So we will have to look how it turns out, but I think these are good rules.
Nothing more.
Okay, so we're at the end of the talk. What I think it's a very good final statement, and I take the privilege to respond to that as well. I think when we talk about AI ethics from a corporate perspective, we think a lot about what that means for external world, so how we're interacting with our customers. But I can tell you from my personal perspective, I'm very happy, and that's resonating what you have been saying, that corporations are defining these kind of criteria, defining these kind of guidelines, because it takes off the pressure to do the right thing for each individual and to be a moral player in that. Of course, we want to do that, and it's the responsibility of every single person to be socially responsible, to have a good moral when they're doing things, but they should not have a disadvantage in a working environment living up to that, and they should be supported by a guiding system of a corporation that is defining core principles, and then it's your decision, of course, to either go to that company, work for that company because you have a similar belief system or not. But it's very important that the company is stressing that and is also protecting the people within the company for doing the right thing. Thanks very much. I hope that was a first entertaining discussion, and I would hope that I see some of you at least discussing that afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.